It's Eric Hines, curator of film at Museum of the Moving Image, and I welcome you to our hour-long celebration of the music of Huey Lewis and the News. This is the Reverse Shot Happy Hour. This is the Wednesday Hump Day edition, which is our second ever installment on a Wednesday for the Reverse Shot Happy Hour. Thanks for finding us on this day of the week. If you are catching up to us on YouTube, thanks for joining us. We're very mindful of the fact that some of you aren't here live, so we appreciate your coming in later on. We also appreciate the support that you've been giving Museum of the Moving Image over these months that we've been doing mostly online programming and several months of the Reverse Shot Happy Hour, which I believe we began back in May, if I believe that might be the case. Anyway, thanks for joining us. Again, thanks for supporting the museum. Quick note about our non-online programming, which actually does happen now at the Queens Drive-In in Corona, Queens. And we are happy to be showing Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing tomorrow night. And 9 to 5 Story of a Movement by Julie Reichert and Steve Bognar tomorrow, Friday, along with the 9 to 5 comedy, Jane Fonda, Dolly Parton, Lily Tomlin. And then we're showing Born in Flames and Back to the Future over the weekend. So high in feminism and labor, as it should be in a moment like this, and in Labor Day weekend in particular. So we appreciate your coming out if you do have a car to join us there, and also appreciate your joining us here today. So that'll be it for our promotional of the Museum of the Moving Image. And I'd love to bring on our hosts for Reverse Shot Happy Hour, the editors and founders of Reverse Shot, Jeff Reichert and Michael Koreski, and longtime contributor and filmmaker, Fariha Zaman.
Thanks, Eric.
Hi, Michael.
Hey,
Hi.
how you doing? Hey, Fariha.
Hi.
Hello. Nice to see you.
Michael, your room has changed.
Yeah, I know. So obviously it's very spare. We're in a hotel room, my husband and I. And because we're traveling, we're going to visit my mom and be safe and socially distanced with her. So this is the first time you're seeing a background that doesn't feel nice and full of bookshelves, and it doesn't have, I usually have a nice magazine cover to display. I don't have that this week. I'm sorry. I have nothing but a bed that Eric said looked illicit.
What about it is illicit?
I cleaned up the sheets. They looked used, but anyway, let's stop the conversation there.
It must be hard to only see your mom distantly. I thought about this. My mom's so far away that actually being in the same room is not an option for a while, but I guess there's a particular difficulty in being close but not close.
Yeah, I mean, we've been tested, but it takes so long to get the results for tests still that I didn't feel like it was safe to, hang out and stay in the house of a 72-year-old woman, and one that I love a lot, my mother. So, we're going to sit outside. There's a porch, thankfully, so it'll be great. It'll work out. We can't watch a movie, which is actually kind of difficult. That's what we like to do. We like to watch movies together. So.
Well, I'm glad you had a lot of time to do that in the past year. For those who don't know, Michael, for a forthcoming book, has spent a lot of time watching and rewatching favorite movies with his mom. That's all I'll say. Getting my mom to watch movies is like pulling teeth. She can't sit for long enough to do it. The last thing we saw in the theater together was The Corpse Bride, and we both agreed it was mediocre.
My parents used to run a movie theater back in the 1980s and 90s, and so they still watch a lot of movies. But over the past few years, for whatever reason, my dad has decided that it was a great idea to invest in VHS, and has acquired some 400 to 500 VHS tapes of films, sometimes acquiring the same film multiple times because he can't remember what films he's purchased from different yard sales. So you'll go into the collection and see 3 Lawrence of Arabia's, 2 Howard's Ends. I'm like, why do you have so many VHSs of the same film? He's like, I don't know, I forget. But he much prefers to watch the movies on VHS at this point, and it's kind of inexplicable.
I've actually assisted Jeff's dad or attempted to organize this collection because I just can't help myself. My producer brain is like, we can make this better. I promise you, it won't be scary. First of all, his parents refer to it as the VHS theater, which I find very charming. They're like, what are we watching tonight on the VHS theater? Second of all, the inventory is one long Word document. So I just tried to make columns, and this was like it messed up the system. They were not having it, so that's why, you know, he just like manually alphabetizes and then picks stuff up. And the one year they made one of Jeff and I's movies into VHS, and they said, how many of your colleagues, a lot of your colleagues might have films still on DVD, but how many of them have had a VHS release?
I was actually looking for that just a second ago.
It was really special, actually. Something about holding that like such a tangible object. Like a DVD is so flimsy by comparison.
Something about having to adjust the tracking on your own movie is it's exotic.
Yeah, but one more anecdote about the VHS cinema before we get into the show. One Christmas, I was watching with my dad what's the Smallest Show on Earth, the Basil Dearden film about a movie theater, and the VHS crapped out in the middle of it, so we switched over to the Criterion channel, which was showing the film, and my dad was just like, he could not believe it because we were able to fast forward the movie to the place where we thought somehow that the internet knew where the VHS had stopped, so it would go right there.
I will say there were certain films at the VH that did feel right at the VHS theater that I really enjoyed. Like there's like definitely a strain of like 80s horror movie that feels great to watch on VHS.
Right.
Like feels like it has a different quality somehow. Well, the way that we grew up watching movies is not a bad transition to the theme today, because I think it shapes our tastes, our experiences with our families. And I think that a lot of what we're bringing to the table, if I remember correctly, kind of makes sense for each of our individual personalities and those of our guests, and maybe the way that we grew up watching films. The theme this week is deal breakers. So talking about films that perhaps not a loved one, because we're not monsters, not for a loved one would I say, I guess we can't be friends anymore if you don't like this movie. But let's say you're on a first date or making a new friend, and they just say that you know what movie I really hate, and you have an immediate response of like, I'm not sure how to continue relating to you if you don't like this movie, or if you do like this movie, or a deal breaker that you've come up against in meeting someone else, where you maybe put your foot in your mouth and mentioned a film that you strongly dislike that is extremely meaningful to that person. I think we all have this sort of line, whether we mean to or not, and we just discover it when we come up against it. We assume, if I love this movie, surely everyone must love this amazing movie. And we have some great guests to talk about this with us, both Reverse Shot contributors. We have a very long time Reverse Shot contributor, an author. He recently had a new book published, which he's going to talk about, Adam Naiman. And then later we'll have Reverse Shot Happy Hour regular, and also Reverse Shot writer and critic Bidatri Chowdhury coming on later. So we would love for Adam to join us now.
All the way from Toronto.
We're from Toronto, Canada.
Hello.
Hey, Adam.
Hi, Adam.
Hey, everybody. Long time friends. Nice to see you all.
Longtime friend and contributor, Adam Naiman.
Yeah.
And
you
Dad.
know, only took 17 weeks, which is the same number of years I've been writing for Reverse Shot to finally be invited to a happy hour. But the timing is really good in terms of the book, so I'm very happy.
Oh, don't think we didn't think about that.
I know.
Or the weeks. It was 100% on purpose. We're just very, very specific that way.
I still remember reaching out to Michael Koreski via email and saying, your website is so good. I have great interest in your product. And Michael was like, that's nice. And then from there,
I just know that was exactly your wording too. Like, you're probably not paraphrasing.
I'll go into my Yahoo email account. And just while we're talking about parents, I'm actually doing this at my parents' place in Toronto because our house is being renovated, and my mom Evelyn is watching. And besides saying hi to my mom, she is also a former Reverse blog contributor, because she used to comment
That's
on
right.
the Sopranos blogs that Michael and Chris and I did. That's how she got to know Michael and Chris, and she still refers to and quotes those extensively. So she loves you guys, which is why she's watching. It has very little to do with me. I'm in her house. She's watching for you.
Well, she's one of my favorite people in the world, as you know, and as she knows.
Yeah.
Please give her a hug from us afterwards.
I'll give her a socially distanced wave.
Yeah, but
From-
three of them from each of
Yes,
us.
from each of you for sure.
Well, Adam, we're really excited about your book, your latest book. You're an author several times over, but you recently published this Thomas Anderson book, and we were wondering if you could show us the cover and talk a little bit about the writing process.
Yeah, there's the cover, which is really nice.
Ooh.
And I won't open it because that's giving away money. But no, what I did,
Back at least.
what I did was I just went through the document of the Coens book, and every time I had the Coen brothers, I just replaced it with Anderson, because they're straight white male formalists, muscular camera movement and themes. It's the same book. No, I mean, this was a really different book, and this was a much harder book to write, I think, for me.
How so?
Because I think with the Coens, there's a wavelength that I've always felt like I'm on with them. Not that my takes on the movie are correct or that there's only one note of interpretation, but I just found that my brain works in a way that lets me appreciate their movies in a way that is satisfactory to me. And when I was writing chapters for the Coens book, I sort of thought, yeah, this is exactly what I want to say. This is how I feel. My feelings are pretty consistent. And while I think Anderson is only maybe weird according to a kind of mainstream metric, like he's not that weird a filmmaker, he's not that out there, I've had really varied reactions to his movies over the years. I mean, if you'd asked me at 18 if I would have ever wanted to write a book about this filmmaker, I would have said absolutely not, because seeing things like Boogie Nights and Magnolia in real time, admittedly as a kid, but still, coming into formation as a critic, I did not like them one bit. And they are still movies that I would say are lesser for me than the other ones. But there was a big turn for me in his work around the time of There Will Be Blood, and really for The Master, which I actually wrote about for Reverse Shot, a piece that, ends up having some of those ideas ended up in the book. And just trying to do justice in some ways to the spaciousness and the openness of some of these movies that I think have lots of ways in and out.
Can I ask for those films that had not necessarily left an impression on you as a younger person, what was the turning point, even if they're still not necessarily your go-tos?
I mean, I think that when Magnolia came out, I was 18. We're all around the same age. I mean, I think Eric's a bit older, Michael's maybe a year or two older, but we're roughly the same generation, right? And it was that idea that certain movies were coming out in the late 90s, especially in 1999, where it was like, this is really important, feels important, this is supposed to be important. And I remember seeing Magnolia just as a civilian around Christmas time and thinking that the movie's not important, it's just a lot, it's excessive, there's too much, it's too aware of its importance, it's too aware of its ambition, it's trying to do too many things. And that hasn't gone away, right? But it's certainly an interesting movie to look back at with 20 years of retrospect, see it as a hinge moment in his career, see it where he shifted, I would say, from ensemble dynamics to these really inscrutable individual protagonists, see where maybe certain things that he had always wanted to put in a movie got out of his system, where certain influences in his work, I wouldn't say fell away entirely, but that was the apex of his Altman stuff. And then he kind of moved in different directions after that. And, with a movie like Boogie Nights, seeing how it's kind of endured as a meme culture movie or a sort of weirdly mainstream title with a lot of residue, left over is a bit of a surprise.
I mean, I asked in part because I had a similar experience for both of those films when they came out. And I think in hindsight, it's just that I didn't get it. I wasn't mature enough to understand what resonates about it. I think my high school brain assessed something that was more theatrical and clean, say Usual Suspects, as quality film. And it's interesting that a director's younger work ages better.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a handle on what most of the hosts and panelists have thought of his recent films, because I read everybody and keep up with everybody. But I do feel that in terms of, let's say, online film culture or film Twitter or whatever you want to call it, there's a heroic quality that he's taken on as he's hit his 40s that's very different than what he meant, let's say, in a pre-internet film culture at the end of the 90s, where he was seen, I think, as really kind of callow and mercurial. and there were pieces that were kind of inveighing against this weird sort of gentrification of 70s cinema that he represented. And I think that he had a lot of hype, but there was an awful lot of like disparagement of him as well. Whereas now, with the exception of, you know, some critics who've written articulate dissent and maybe some people who just, you know, for whatever reason don't like the work, he's kind of like unanimously beloved. And beloved is not the word that you would have used for a movie like Magnolia, where, I mean, man, the critical response to that was polarized. And the negative reviews, some of which are so very persuasive to read, like people were writing that like their lives depended on it. They're like, we cannot accept this as the vanguard of American movie making. The original reviews are pretty harsh.
My response to him over the years has been really varied, and I've had there hasn't been a single Paul Thomas Anderson movie that I haven't had some kind of reassessment of over the course of my knowledge of them and my feelings about them. But what's interesting is how that's changed, is that the films in the first part of his career, I was kind of obsessed with. I loved them almost without question when I first saw them. With the exception of Hard Eight, which I came to later and I saw once, so I can't really comment much on. But Boogie Nights, especially Magnolia and Punch Drunk Love specifically, are films that when I first saw, I had such strong emotional reactions to, and their kineticism I was so drawn towards, and they came to me at such an impressionable age, coming of age in my cinephilia, that I can't, like, I almost, like Magnolia, I basically know by heart. I saw Magnolia 6 times in the theater when it came out. 6 times, that's 18 hours, okay? And I just kept going back and watching it. I saw Punch Drunk Love at New York Film Festival. I thought it was kind of like shot for shot perfect. I was kind of, and now I really have trouble with those movies. Like I tried to watch part of Magnolia a couple times recently, and I just couldn't do it. Like I had such a hard time getting through it. And Punch Drunk Love, I'm kind of like horrified by in a lot of ways. It's kind of a horrifying movie that's just impeccably made and so inventive and interesting. But from There Will Be Blood on, they just actually grow in estimation after I've seen them. Like Phantom Thread is an example of the opposite. Like when I first saw it, I said, oh, that's interesting, but a little strange. And then, you know, within a week, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then when I saw it again, I thought it was maybe a masterpiece. So I think that's the sign of a good filmmaker, probably, right? His films seem to be getting deeper, seem to be getting more mature and rich. And I'm not actually saying that I don't still like those first films. I have intense admiration for them, but they do feel like the work of a young filmmaker who's just trying a lot of things out.
Yeah, well, one thing that I tried to do in this book, I'll just explain it quickly, is to scramble the auteur narrative by taking the films in chronological order of when they're set. The book begins with There Will Be Blood, moves through The Master and Inherent Vice, and I'm by no means the first person to perceive that work as a kind of trilogy, a kind of Southern California, or at least 20th century psychogeographic group. But it also becomes really interesting then when you look at how those movies lead into, say, the 70s and 80s as imagined in Boogie Nights. And then you see Magnolia as this kind of millennial hinge movie, because it's really, the thing about that movie, whether it's his best or not, which I don't think it is, it has such a sense of imminence, of being inside something that is about to happen. And that's what I find moving about it in retrospect, is it's such a hinge movie. You know, people talk about that summer of 99 and they've mythologized the movies of 1999, I think, over much. But Magnolia really is the one of those movies that's sort of about what is coming and the future and the possibility of an end and a new beginning. But I took them out of order because I just think we've all read, and some of us have written those pieces about Anderson where it's like from callousness to maturity, you know, from unevenness to mastery. It's not wrong. But I think that if you take that out of the equation, the way the movies relate to each other is that much more interesting. And then you have Phantom Thread, which is not just out of LA and out of America, but to me, and I won't go on about it here, it's in the book, but so much to me a movie about time, you know, which I know sounds like very chin strokey and meditative, and aren't all movies about time, and movies are painting with time and all that. But that's what really revealed itself about Phantom Thread to me in writing about it, is the extent to which it's sort of about time. And so I kind of had to find a way to place it within this chronology that we've come up with. And I'll be curious to see if people think that the order of the book works. You know, I don't know, works in my head. We'll see if it works for people reading it.
Part of what speaks to me about, you know, your approach is that I think it's easy or tempting to sometimes say that as a filmmaker matures and the work does sort of appreciably become deeper or even just better in some way, but that must be because, like, again, it's tighter, cleaner, and there's like a looseness and space that's always been present in his style. And like, I use the word a little bit messy, like a willingness to engage in mess that just feels more purposeful. It's not that it's been lost, it's that it's been like engaged with newly. And I've always appreciated that, and appreciated actually even in Phantom Thread, moments where I doubted, where I'm like, I'm not sure where this is going. I feel uncomfortable. Maybe I'm not okay with this. And then like coming to the conclusion more gradually felt like something earned.
There's a bit in a really good, pretty dissenting essay on him by Reverse Shot longtime contributor Nick Pinkerton, where Nick talks about the grand gesture in Anderson's films as a kind of escape hatch, right? I bow to no one in my respect for Nick, and his analysis of the films is really interesting. I mean, to me, the way he characterizes the endings of There Will Be Blood or The Master, for me, interpretively, I have an answer for them. I don't think that they're these Hail Marys. I think they're deeply built into the fabric and structure of the movies. But I think for the people who don't like them or who have skepticism about them, what made Phantom Thread different, and I think what makes it seem controlled, is that it doesn't really throw downfield that much, you know? Like, there is nothing in that movie that is equivalent to A Rain of Frogs as a way to end the movie, or Slow Boat to China as a way to get out of the as a way to get out of the narrative. There is a big twist in Phantom Thread, but it's not that same altering the texture and fabric and tone of the movie. And I would say that of all the movies he's made, it's, even if it's only my second favorite, my favorite being The Master, there is nothing he has made that has the tonal control that Phantom Thread has. You can watch that movie looking for a false or an off note, and it's not there to me, which makes it different than his other movies, which are tonally a bit all over the place and flawed. It's funny. Sorry. Well, the title of the book is Masterworks, which is very much a play on the master and also the idea of working, because we have interviews with his collaborators and discussions of his process. To me, he's one of the great filmmakers who doesn't make flawless movies. Phantom Thread to me is flawless, or very close. But I wouldn't say flawless is an adjective that gets used a lot in this book.
I was just going to say it's an emotional twist, not a plot twist. Like, or for me personally, it was about like the thing that I was uncertain of is like basically what is the perspective of the film and how do I feel about it? And what is the, from a feminist standpoint, what exactly is this saying about what's happening? And that I thought was a masterful thing. Like for me to, it made it, the experience was better because I doubted.
Yeah, and for a filmmaker whose films are in title and action a repository of dick jokes, and I'm not saying that glibly.
Yeah.
You go from Hard Eight to Boogie Nights to the Respect the Cock in Magnolia. You have The Master opens with something about herpes. Even in Phantom Thread, you have The House of Woodcock. I mean, this is a thing in his work. For Phantom Thread to attempt, and I think really interestingly navigate that perspectival switch, which doesn't seem to be a switch. You think of that movie as being about Daniel Day-Lewis, but it's not. It's from her point of view, from the first line and the first second and the first shot. And for him to try that, I think, is really quite dazzling. But I don't want to say too much, and I don't want to take up too much time, but that's some of the stuff that the book's about.
Well, we have a quick question from the audience before we move on to the deal breakers. Actually, two questions. Nicole asks if you feel that Anderson is an open book kind of guide towards film journalists, and also if you have any feelings about Benny Safdie's casting in Anderson's latest film.
My feelings about Benny Safdie are very warm because he and Josh wrote a really beautiful, heartfelt intro to the book. I asked them last September, right before Uncut Gems came out, I'm like, do you guys want to write a foreword? And they're like, sure. And I'm like, well, I'm worried that this movie's going to make you famous and you're not going to have time. And then Uncut Gems made them extremely famous, and they found time. So I'm very grateful to Benny. I'm interested to see his performance in this. I assume it will not be the same as his performance in Good Time. And as for Anderson being an open book, I don't know. This is, I'm as happy to say this here as anywhere else, which is that he's not someone who I've engaged with directly. I've engaged with him indirectly because he's super aware of the book and apparently happy about it and wants to see it. But much like with the Coens, who are much less of an open book. The Coens are like a closed vault, They're aware of the book. I will never hear from them about it, and that actually makes me happy because that's their way. I don't know what Anderson's going to say or think about this. I'll say this about his interviews. They got a lot better over time. Those old Paul Thomas Anderson interviews kind of hurt to read in some parts because he's very earnest and hard on his sleeve and young. His interviews about Phantom Thread are chill and hilarious if you haven't read them. So funny. So I think in the same way that maybe he's improved as a filmmaker, he's improved as an interview subject.
So I'm gonna bring forward this one last question for you because it's a very simple one, which is favorite of 2007, No Country or There Will Be Blood?
My trick question. Favorite film of 2007 is Zodiac. Easily the three of those movies that has taken on the most weight and durability for me. But between There Will Be Blood and No Country for Old Men, I prefer No Country for Old Men.
I just saw Zodiac for the first time this year.
I
missed it when it came out, and it's just one of those movies of a length and subject matter that you have to steel yourself up for, and I was like, I got nothing but time.
Fareeha, do you want to hijack this podcast and just talk about Elias Koteas's pants in Zodiac?
I think that we could at the very least, do a little bonus material about it.
Yeah.
I think it would be a great time to bring in our second guest, Bidatri Chowdhury.
Hi, Bidatri.
Hi.
Bidatri, do you have any Paul Thomas Anderson deal breakers specifically?
See, for me, and I think we'll talk about it more about like, you know, the thing about deal breakers is like, I'm not so offended when people say they didn't like something, but I'm offended when they dismiss something. You know, if someone is like, oh, I hate Paul Thomas Anderson, all his films, that will be like, you know, that's more of a deal breaker for me than if someone tells me, oh, I didn't like Cigarettes and Coffee. And I'm like, why? And then we have a conversation. So, yeah. And having said that, I have had people tell me they don't like Cigarettes and Coffee, which is actually one of the first films I watched when I wanted to watch good films or, you know, wanted to educate myself on films. So I really like that film, and it's a very special film for me. And I always do a little jerk in my heart when people say they didn't like that film. But
just to clarify, are you talking about Jim Jarmusch's?
No, she's talking about the Anderson short.
Yeah.
Oh, got it.
Deep in the archives. Also, that's such a wonderful stance to have as a critic in particular, and I feel slightly ashamed. I'm like, no, sometimes I do get mad when people don't like something.
No, I think the reason why is why I get mad more. Like, you know, why do you not like it? And that says a lot about a person.
Actually, I will say you're reminding me that one of my, like a very general feeling that I have is when people respond to documentaries with "it was bad." Why was it bad? Because it didn't tell me how to solve the problem. So, for example, there was like one of the most high-profile reviews that Jeff and I had of our first film together, Remote Area Medical. It was basically like, well, these things were well done, but also you didn't tell me how to fix a healthcare crisis. And I was like, that's because I don't know how.
Exactly.
Why would you think I know how to do that? And of course, I could rant all day about how that's not necessarily the responsibility of someone who's trying to create art that happens to be in a nonfiction mode.
Yeah. And
but
also, sorry, go on.
Well, it wasn't that they had a criticism. We had plenty of criticisms. It's that the reason why didn't reflect any sort of thought or like artistic consideration.
With documentaries, I also think people sometimes have a problem because they didn't hear from the other side, which I think is bizarre, especially as someone working with documentaries, not just writing about them. I think that's a bizarre problem to have. That, you know, yes, I am, you know, if I'm making a film about the healthcare crisis, I'm not going to talk to the president of the country or the health minister of the country. Like, you know, this is not what this documentary is about. So I do think with documentary, one, the thing that you said about like, you didn't give me a solution.
Yeah.
And B, you did not, it's not an objective documentary because you did not talk to the other side. So yeah, those are two pretty deal-breaking stances to have on documentaries.
Adam, what are some of the deal breakers you thought of when we started talking about this week?
I asked people to guess on Twitter, and I said that no one got it. Eventually, someone did. I was originally going to talk about, of all things, Greg Batola's Adventureland, which is a movie that I wrote about for reverse shot, and which I just adore. But again, because my mom's watching, I think the movie that I'll mention, which is one of her favorites and is just as fun, if not more fun, for me to talk about, is Philip Kaufman's version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It's one of the first posters that someone ever got me, that a friend ever got me, because I'd shown her the film in high school. So that was something that was kind of picked up on pretty early. And it's a movie that I guess, not in a systematic way, but I showed it to most significant people in my life at some point or another, or checked to see if they've watched it. And to me, that's maybe like a more generous version of what we mean by deal breaker. I saw when this was announced online that this was the topic, people were like, you can't make people like films, and why are you bullying people into movies? And everyone has their own opinion. I didn't think that was the spirit that the topic was intended in. It's sort of more of, what is a movie that really reflects for you why you like movies, how you like them, times in your life where you've watched things that really mean something to you, where if someone were to say to you, I don't like it, you would just have an odd reaction. And so for me, that film, which is built on great subject matter, the Jack Finney book and the Don Siegel movie, and witty enough to have a part for Don Siegel, as well as to cast Leonard Nimoy as like the friendly face of an alien invasion, and just has the best cast of 70s actors outside of an Altman movie. Like you've got Sutherland and Brooke Adams and Veronica Cartwright and Jeff Goldblum, who are all really sexy and weird and funny, so that when they're taken over by aliens, you actually lose something, which isn't the case in movies like this a lot. And then it's just so beautifully made and scary and original. Like it's not that I can't imagine someone not liking it. I just like it more than I can say. So in that sense, it would be kind of a deal breaker movie for me.
Film that I've loved since childhood. I know we bonded on before. We
Yeah.
bonded over it before, Adam. And so thankfully our relationship was not torn asunder because we both loved it so much.
No, although we've also had some pretty fun diverging reactions to things too, which to me is the best part of friendship and film talking. That was the only thing I wanted to say, is never understood this idea that disagreeing about a movie is a reason to like be mad at someone.
Well, sometimes it's not necessarily that the feeling is upset, but simply that you hadn't considered, right? Like it can still be an ultimately good experience, like all of you are describing, where like, oh, you forced me to consider a different opinion, but until you hear it, you had not necessarily considered that one might have that response. And we had a good comment from the chat, actually, from Aidan Morgan, who said, I'm realizing there's a difference between a deal breaker and a favorite film. Mulholland Drive is probably my favorite movie, but I understand negative reactions to the material. On the other hand, when someone complains about There Will Be Blood, I'm aghast.
I was trying to think about this topic a lot, and I don't know if I came up with anything definitive from my perspective, but it was very interesting seeing the different reactions to the question posed on Twitter. First of all, never pose a question on Twitter. that's what I have learned.
Wait, is that how to fix Twitter? People not
don't solicit opinions.
Michael figured it out.
But like the responses were like one of two things. Well, there were three. There was people just saying the movies that they loved, just like definitively and happily. And then there were the people who refused, just flat out rejected the concept, saying, well, I'm an adult, so I don't have any deal breakers. And I'm thinking, well, maybe, okay, you're not really getting the spirit of this. It's sort of like a joke. We're not actually going to break up with significant others or lose friendships over this. It's just a term. And then the third was, how dare you say that? But by the way, here are my 3 titles. Which I guess is more in keeping with how I feel about it.
That sounds sort of like a corollary response to me, is when people are mad about a serious criticism that you had of a mainstream film, and the comment is, God, why do you take it so fucking seriously? It's just a movie. And I'm like, it's just a movie, but you read this entire review, developed a very strong feeling about it, and took the time to respond. So clearly it has some resonance for you.
Also, we don't accept the just a movie phrase in this.
Yes, but it's such a common thing that you like immediately want to reject it, but then you like, in doing so, you're kind of re-entering the loop. I mean, I will say again, as we mentioned, it's not about, hey, this relationship is over because we disagree, but I've had real anxieties about other people's deal breakers. So when I started hanging out with these two, I knew that like an across the board reverse shot favorite was oh Oh my God, I'm blanking on the name now. The Steven Spielberg movie with Haley Joel Osment. AI. See, I can't even bring myself to say the name because it causes me so much anxiety. It was such a favorite. And I was like, if I watch this movie that I have not seen and I don't like it, I feel like it will put a crimp in our professional relationship in some capacity. Like there'll be some way in which I'm like not as much a part of the team. And obviously that's not true, but I had to like steel myself up to watch it because of the ensuing potential disagreement and debate.
Hold on, Michael, do you like AI?
I'm not going to bring it up here. We will not talk about it during this episode.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about AI a little bit prior to this episode, and I will say that for me, it's one of my most favorite films of all time, and it's one of the films that's sort of foundational in the for the story of Reverse Shot. And Michael and I bonding over AI was one of the things that led to the creation of the journal. But it's still one of those movies where I can totally see the objections. I can totally understand somebody walking away from that movie and not connecting with it, not finding an entry point into it. It's not like another movie that I know Freya wanted to bring up, like Summer Hours, Olivia Assayas's Summer Hours, where, if I heard somebody really doesn't like Summer Hours, which I have, I question something about their humanity.
But we have a very good friend who's a great filmmaker that we've had this exact debate with, where this person does not like Summer Hours. I'm not going to out them because I think that that's rude, and I still struggle with this. But there's like maybe the category of like deeply humanist films that people respond to negatively is a particular difficulty.
But and I do want to. Sorry, Badatri. I know I want to get to you in 1 second. I want to hear what your first deal breaker is, but I just want to say quickly about Summer Hours. It's actually an interesting, for me, example of a movie that I can actually totally understand both sides of, because while it is beautiful, humanist, it makes me cry, I adore it. There is, for a lot of people who object to it, they object to it on somewhat pseudo-political grounds. In other words, they find it to be an incredibly bourgeois film, and it's inherently bourgeois. It's about bourgeois things. It's about inheritance and money and wealthy people and wealthy white people. And I get having that reaction to it, and I get that political response to it, being someone who absolutely loves it. So it's actually a really good example of a movie that I can understand all sides from. Sorry, Badatri, you're muting because of the honking. I didn't realize.
No, I guess it's better now. I think one thing I really try, I find it very difficult to, talk to people about when they call something boring, like a film is boring, and I'm like, well, what is happening in your lives?
What's so great about what you're doing?
And Michael, you will like my answer. I defend A Quiet Passion a lot with my friends because I really, I mean, I'm touching the title of deal breaker very lightly, but if someone's like, oh, I hated A Quiet Passion because it's so boring, and that is something, I mean, that idea of approaching a film as boring is kind of a deal breaker for me. And lately, it's happened a lot with A Quiet Passion.
Something that Jeff and I get a lot is that movie sounds like a bummer, which is something that's also had in terms of feedback to a film that we were working on. We're like, yes, racism is a bummer. I didn't invent it, and I won't apologize for that. But it's, again, like I understand needing particular time. You can't watch certain films at certain moments, but the idea of like dislike in response to a reflection of a reality that exists. I know this is coming from just like such a doc person place, but it's, I find it abhorrent, that response.
Sorry, Mike, what were you going to say?
No, please. You can probably predict.
Were you going to talk about AI?
I was going to go back to Davies because I was so happy that I wasn't the one to bring up Terrence Davies. I'm not sure, you made my day, but Adam, please.
Where I think this might in some ways get more contentious and messy, and not more interesting because it's already interesting, but where I think some of the very civilized, polite ways we're talking about this might flip, is if you invert the idea of deal breaker to, I cannot understand why someone would like that movie. And that is a function, I think, of to some extent online discourse, and when things like ideology and morality and like really strongly held aesthetic principles, whatever that means, that sentence is gobbledygook that I just said, but whatever, you know, come into the fray. I think that I don't know if I consider it a problem or funny, probably sign of a life well lived, that people, what they talk about deal breaking movies with me is in terms of stuff they know I quite dislike, and not just in a passing way of like, oh yeah, I don't think you like that. They're like, I know exactly why you hated that. My poor, wonderful wife, Tanya, has heard me rant about films that I don't like a lot, to the point where she's got that part of my argument memorized, you know? And I think that that's where the deal breaker thing comes in too. Like, I cannot fathom why someone would like Juno, for instance. I can't fathom it. I cannot apply my powers of imagination to the point where someone is like, I had an enjoyable experience watching that movie. That's where I think maybe the niceness that we're showing would fall away if it was deal breaking in the other direction, even though the principles are not actually different than what we're talking about. I'm not saying we're being hypocritical. I'm saying when you're talking about things you like, it's easy to be magnanimous. When it's like, I really don't like that, all bets are off.
No, I remember walking out of films like Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain, or Shane Carruth's Upstream Color, and just sort of wondering like, what person could find anything in these movies? And then seeing plenty of positive reviews of both films and just feeling maybe like constituted from the wrong parts in some way.
Jeff, wasn't your review of The Fountain met with just like a stream of vitriol from people who found that to be a deal breaker about you, including like some quite personal things about like, I heard this guy's a filmmaker, he's just jealous of Darren Aronofsky.
Yeah, that was Black Swan. But anyway.
Okay, yeah, but sort of a similar, I don't know, the fan base has a particular anger with you for daring to dislike it. You know, part of what inspired the topic is this old Uproxx article. I think it's from 2014, where they did this, you know, the author did a roundtable, and I found one of the funniest responses, even though I don't necessarily share this, I neither love nor hate this movie, was Inception. And the contributors' issue was like, as soon as you ask someone to defend why they like it or even explain the plot to you, like they just look more and more panicked as the conversation goes on. Like there's just no digging yourself out of the hole of it, and I get lost in the nonsensical. And I think like part of it, in terms of like how can you like this movie, might be, as you said, Adam, fed by the response, like the cultural response, critical response. So one for me is Requiem for a Dream. And the thing is, I probably wouldn't even think about this movie. I just sort of forgotten it, except for, and I've talked about this phenomenon, there's a moment where you like get to college. I was going to say everybody, but maybe not everybody, but I think many people have a sort of insecurity about like finding your people and appearing, you know, to be like film literate and being like, no, I'm a serious movie person. I can be with the movie people. And there are cultural signifiers that you're all trying to share as like 17, 18, 19-year-olds. And one, when I entered college, was Requiem for a Dream. And I had to secretly be like, but it's so bad. Like, I guess I don't like movies if this has been set up as the premise for movie appreciation.
I caught part of it on TV the other night, and it was just on, and I looked at Chris and I said, is this really what this movie was like? Because I mean, I never liked it really that much at all, but it struck me as being particularly heinous I mean, just like aesthetically impoverished and disgusting and terrible. I was looking at it. But this also, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. If you want to talk more. No, this just made me think about, you know, what it is we're actually talking about sometimes. Obviously, there are any, you know, I think everyone's gotten at this a little bit, but what is it that makes a film something that we would either, you know, that we either can't believe someone else would like, or that we like and others doesn't? Is it an aesthetic thing? Is it a political thing? I think because movies have all these facets, that's how it's so easy to separate them out. Like, I can understand why you would aesthetically like a certain movie while also finding it politically abhorrent or politically specious, or even just stupid on some level, and are not well thought out. But like, are there films where like everything comes together? It's just politically
Oh.
awful, aesthetically awful. Those are the films that I would say, like mine. I'm just gonna say, everyone knows Peter Jackson's The Lovely Bones. If anybody likes that movie in the world, I am flabbergasted. I think on every level, it is just an atrocity.
Well, the Lovely Bones is probably in the top 3 movies that Michael and I have laughed together at via in person or separately over the years. Another one being The Paperboy, which I saw with you, and is the only movie I can remember you not being able to follow. I'll never forget Michael Koreski at 20 minutes into The Paperboy being like, "Are they cops? What is going on?"
I
But
like The Paperboy.
But what I was going to say to Michael's point about whether it's aesthetics or politics, a movie that I know Michael doesn't like and that I wrote about for Reverse Shot and tried to write about carefully. And actually, if I remember the notes Michael gave me on it at the time, he's like, "You're being really restrained on this," is something like Son of Saul, which is a really interesting template for this idea of a deal breaker, because I can completely understand what someone is reacting to in that movie and what they're responding to. I also can't stand it. And it's not that I can't stand someone who would respond positively to that or can't stand their response, but if I'm actually thinking like, what is a movie where I feel like my response to this and someone else's response to this separate something? Not separate us as people, not make one of us good or one of us bad, but just like, I really cannot think any other way about this movie than the way I think. That might be a kind of line in the sand negative one for me too.
Yeah,
I'm thinking about it.
Yes, I mean, yeah, it's a good example. I find it loathsome, and a lot of people that I think are extremely intelligent, really smart thinkers about cinema think it's excellent, and I'm totally accepting of that.
I do want to let you know, Adam, that Luke Vincent says that one of their favorite ever 11 Offenses entry was the one written about Juno.
Oh, good. Lots more where that comes from.
Hey, look who's reappeared.
You know, I'll admit that there are some, like we're talking about aesthetic principle, there are some films that I have such a like personal attachment to or affinity for. I was talking to Jeff about this, that I guess if someone told me that they just hated the Apu trilogy, I think I know it's irrational, but my initial response would be like, "You don't like me or my culture." I'd just be like, "You're not trying to understand."
I'm with you on that.
You don't want to understand this beautiful language with centuries of history. You get it, Bidatri?
Yes. And I mean, I also it's similar with me when people say they don't like Bollywood. Like they just say, "I don't like Bollywood."
Yeah.
Which just doesn't mean anything except for the fact that perhaps you're a racist person.
Well, I was actually curious because I was thinking, and this is it's sort of a question that I want to pose to Bidatri and Adam too. I was remembering myself as a very young kid, as a 5-year-old in kindergarten, when I was starting to become the annoying person you see before you. And I was absolutely obsessed with Fantasia, okay? Like, the Disney film, which I still am. But I mean, from an early age, I was 5 years old. My mom took me to see Fantasia. As most people know or might know, it's a non-narrative film. It's the first time, if you see this film as a child, it's the first time you ever think about such a thing as non-narrative, because you're told, oh, this is interesting, but there's no story. It's just going to be beautiful images and classical music. So from an early age, it teaches you something about storytelling and lack of it. And I remember being so incensed when the other kids in my kindergarten class didn't like it because they said it was boring and they said there was no story, that I would end up just proselytizing endlessly and becoming actually quite annoying, that some of the kids would start crying because I was telling them, "No, you don't understand it. You're just stupid. There's not supposed to be a story," because I loved it so much. And I was already at that point, I started to feel really alienated from everybody around me. I'm just wondering if anyone else had the experience with, not that film specifically, but like,
little Michael making
this is a very young example of this. It doesn't have to be kindergarten, but was there like a turning point film where you find yourself in opposition to everyone else at an early age? I know it's an early age, but hey, it's Fantasia. You can't not like Fantasia.
I was super annoying I guess I was in my late teens at this point, about The Sweet Hereafter. And my friends all see it. I saw it repeatedly. I tried to convince them that, how good it was, how smart it was, how the narrative scrambling was so interesting. And then, damn, if I didn't try to watch it a few years ago, and I realized that all of my friends who earlier on were like, This is not very good. They were correct.
Jeff, me too. And I lived in New Delhi, and it was really hard to get a VHS copy of The Sweet Hereafter. And I made all my friends watch it, and they're like, "This is stupid." And I like wouldn't talk to them for a week at least over The Sweet Hereafter.
Why are we just beating up on a Canadian filmmaker when we have a Canadian critic on here?
Well, to cite another Canadian filmmaker, I still remember having all my sweet jock boy pals over when we were like 13 to be like, you know what we're gonna watch, guys? It's really good. It's called Dead Ringers. I really like this movie, Dead Ringers.
No.
You guys watch this? We watched it at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the living room of my house, where like my parents were milling about behind us, you know, like using the sink and screaming about something. And you know, I was like, so what'd you guys think of Dead Ringers? And they did not like it. And it made me really mad, because I was like, don't you guys see that it's like this other thing, and it's, you know, it's about Cronenberg and the body. It basically shows verbatim off stuff that I'd read because I was like 13. And that made me really mad. And Dead Ringers was then used to basically torture me for about a year, where they were like, you can't pick movies anymore because of Dead Ringers.
A friend of mine.
It's a really good movie is Dead Ringers. Great movie.
A friend of mine called me a pervert for showing The Shining at my 13th slumber party, and I told her to grow up.
This reminds me of, I think we were watching In the Mood for Love, and I think we were in early college or high school that time, and then my friend said I was being very immoral when I I'm like,
wow.
See, like, I can't believe you're like cheering for extramarital affairs. And I'm like, okay, I guess we're not going to talk about this. So I'm like, yeah, I do remember being called immoral for liking Wong Kar-wai.
This strikes me as something, this category of thing that might happen more frequently to non-cis men people. Like, can you imagine being told that your taste is, I guess so. I guess if you like love Lars von Trier and someone gets mad at you about, you know, potentially like the treatment of actresses on set, but at least at a younger age, I think that as a criticism, like, what's wrong with you for liking this movie, when you haven't necessarily signed on to the depiction of relationships or whatever that's happening on screen.
This also connects to something that's become a real fundamental thing in online culture, and this idea of like people, you know, saying this friend of mine or this partner of mine, you know, recommended something to me as if this is a bad thing. Now, there is a difference between recommending and bullying, and there's a difference between wanting to share something and insisting someone have a correct reaction. And I would argue that especially when you talk about a certain kind of, you know, really hyped up straight kind of guy energy, I see where it's coming from. But where the criticism comes from, especially someone who's felt guilty maybe about acting that way in the past. But I do not like the way that this idea of wanting to share something with someone is automatically like just seen as suspect, or, you know, is sort of automatically seen as a one-way transference. I mean, not just in relationships, but in friendships and in families. And something else I've talked to Michael about a lot, that idea of wanting to share something you like, it's one of the absolute best reasons to watch and like something, is to share it. I'm not trying to be like mushy about it, but it's true. Like that desire of like, I saw this and I want you to see it. That feeling rules.
Yeah.
And
it really does. There's nothing I like more.
Yeah, I miss it. I feel like that's part of being like a younger cinephile too, or a younger who love any kind of art, wanting to share. I feel like I lose that a little bit as I age. I become more introverted.
I also treasure the idea of validation, and I'm not just saying this because Adam's here. Like, I've always liked Showgirls, and I haven't been able to explain why till I read the book, and I'm like, oh, this is why, you know, this is why I've always liked the film, and I wasn't able to express why. And so I think I also really like that idea of validation, that, oh, somebody else thinks this is great.
What's your favorite part of Showgirls?
I like the whole film. I really like the film a lot.
Everything.
Everything.
I want you to know, Adam, that when I had first moved to New York, so I was 21 and I had no money to do anything, a friend visited me from London and we just did a series of, like, you're like, maybe this will be fun. I don't know anything about the city and I can't afford to do anything. And then one night she's like, let's do something very American. And we got McDonald's and watched Showgirls. And she was like, that was exactly what I asked for. Thank you. Eric, do you have deal breakers that you have been dying to mention? Or are you going to punt?
This is no, not at all. This is like this is the best hour. I've been like laughing out loud throughout the entire time and reacting, talking to my screen as if you could hear me and you can't. It was fun. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, it's funny. I had all things that I could say, but for you bringing up the being offended by Lars von Trier, and I've definitely spent times in my life. I remember seeing Dancer in the Dark in like a packed multiplex audience, sitting in the back row, and as it was ending, I stood up and I started looking around the audience to see who was having an emotional response, so that I could judge them with my eyes, because I was so appalled by the film and what it was doing and and how it was manipulating people into having what I thought was the morally opposite reaction to what they thought they were having. I was so upset about this.
Eric has a great Lars von Trier piece that should be linked in Reverse Shot. A great, like, definitive 9-point takedown of Lars von Trier when Mandalay came out. But
I'm with you on Dancer in the Dark particularly. That was also my college era signifier that I was like, I cannot get behind this, and I need some time to be able to say that because of how strong the response will be.
Yeah, but I like what Dr. was saying before about, like, I think that what resonates the most with this idea for me is the kind of like the dismissal, the kind of like, I'm not going to engage, is the thing that offends me the most. Like, if somebody like passionately hates something that I love and they have a real response and a reason for it, I have to respect that, even though like I might struggle with it. But so like, and this happens a lot with documentaries. Like, there's a way in which people can't even talk about like Frederick Wiseman without just sort of saying they're long. The first thing is, oh, they're long, like as if that's the only thing to say about something, a body of work this significant and important. And just kind of like from the outset, I'm not going to engage with this thing because it is just somehow, people shut down. I think that's the thing that I react to the most. And not to bring it up again twice in the same podcast, so whatever, happy hour, is that my shutting down about AI to Jeff and Michael and them convincing me to see it again resulted in the greatest turnaround I've ever had in a film. Like, I went from dismissing it and being appalled by it and thinking it was a piece of shit to it being one of my favorite films, like, truly. And that took listening to friends and, as you're saying, Adam, like sharing something, saying, no, watch it again. We're not going to dismiss you. We're not going to dislike you. We're not going to disown you from Reverse Shot, but maybe check it out again. And it was,
I mean, Eric, just to be honest, it was touch and go.
Also, I just remembered Michael, in particularly watching Home for the Holidays with my older sister, and she texted me the entire thing, and I was mad. So it's a lie to say that I never get upset about it or take it personally.
Well, that's a problem. I mean,
that's a problem.
That's like independent of the film.
Has anybody ever had a film where somebody convinced you to hate something that you loved?
I feel like I've unfortunately tried to not talk people out of movies, but had a kind of a what's the word? Tried to do that thing. But I don't think I've ever been talked out of anything.
I've more not even necessarily been talked into it, but just like had my, some, like people say there's a thin line between love and hate. Like sometimes an extreme emotional response is hard to parse through. And this is why, we've talked a bunch with each other about like this, like a knee-jerk Twitter grading response from a critic. It's like, but how can you fully understand what that emotion was? Like, The Future is a film that I initially responded to so negatively. Also Black Swan. And then I did that thing where I was like, it's so stupid. I hate it. It's so dumb. It's so dumb. And then I watched it like 4 times and I was like, I like this movie. And whatever principles that I was stuck on thinking that it's like allegedly bad or objectively bad are irrelevant. I just needed time to get there.
Someone just put something in the chat that I just wanted to speak to. Luke says, reading Jonathan Rosenbaum's criticism of the Coens, which I adore, was an important experience. I love that comment, not just because I'm also interested in Rosenbaum's criticisms of the Coens, both his really goofy ones and some of his more solid ones, is maybe not so much being talked out of a movie, but being read out of a movie, or testing your principles against an absolutely dead to rights piece of criticism.
Yeah.
The piece I mentioned earlier that Nick wrote about Anderson for The Point, I don't know if you want to put it in the chat if one of you can find it. It was written for a magazine called The Point. It's not about talking me out of anything, but I read that piece several times while reading the book, because it's like, that is the case for the prosecution, made as well as it possibly could be made. That's how you really, really test your principles and your interest in film. Not to be right and for someone else to be wrong, but to be like, someone else is clearly seeing the same movies that I am, right? And with the Coens, you happen to have a few of the major American film critics, Rosenbaum, Kerr, and Hoberman, hate them so much. And this is the understatement of the year to say that Dave Kerr and Jay Hoberman are not dumb people. You know, I'm not exactly like breaking new ground by saying that. That's a sobering thing. So even if it's not your best friend or your partner or your mom talking out of a movie, if you read enough film criticism, you have that experience. And as opinionated as I can come off as, and as persuasive as I try and be, it's a great experience. It's equal to wanting to share something that you like with someone, is coming up against something that really actually makes you kind of go like, huh.
Rosenbaum wrote one of, I mean, he's incredibly important and influential for me as a critic too, but his piece on Schindler's List was meaningful to me because I had a profound emotional experience watching Schindler's List, extremely important, profound experience. And then I read that review where he shared that he also had a profound emotional response and then tore it apart. And that opened me up to the idea that I could have an intellectual and emotional response, and they could be differing and they could exist at the same time. That could be allowed, not just an emotional one.
Can I respond to that real quick? I know that we're over our hour, but that's a really good example because I've been kind of racking my brain trying to think about something in response to the question. And Schindler's List is a great example because when I saw it, I was 14 when it came out. It was a very impressionable time generally. I was really starting to think about how films are made. Clearly it was aesthetically unimpeachable. I was fascinated by the project. I'm Jewish. Everything about it was just so overwhelming to me that I thought it was one of the greatest things I'd ever seen in my life. And I still think it's a masterpiece in so many ways. However, having read so much about that film and critiques of that film over the years, including by my very brilliant husband, frankly, and also Rosenbaum and a lot of people, and just like, Claude Lanzmann, the general idea around it. There are things about it now that I just absolutely cannot accept. There are things about Schindler's List that are absolutely unacceptable. While I also believe that it's, one of the most aesthetically amazing American films, with its heart in the right place and all that. But politically, there are things that are quite dubious about it. So that's a really good example, and of splitting off those two emotions, the aesthetics and the politics, or at least representational politics. But yeah. But we shouldn't end on Schindler's List.
I was just gonna say, I think we can all agree that if you don't like Magic Mike XXL, it's going to be tough. Okay, it's not a hard no, but maybe you just don't care about women's desire. I don't know.
Or people who reject that flat out, that is an issue. I've heard so many people, without really knowing much about it, just assume that Magic Mike XXL is some kind of a campy bad movie when it's actually a terrific movie on almost every level. That's a great example.
I'm not sure that Adam cares about women's desire. He's been very quiet about that.
Sorry, what?
I said, I don't know if you care.
I love Magic Mike XXL.
I knew he loved Magic Mike.
Great. And there's a really great piece on that film by Kate Rennebaum in an older issue of CinemaScope that I remember when the issue came out, people opened it up and rereading it like, why is Scope writing about this movie? And I'm like, well, you clearly haven't watched it. Not only is it so much better than the original Magic Mike, like much better, it's just a pretty much perfect movie. I agree with Michael, almost flawless.
Is that what we toast today?
Let's toast Magic Mike. Let's check it out.
And look what Chris got from you from the vending machine in honor of Adam for being here.
I had dental work, so I'm drinking water today.
And while we're toasting, shout out to the reverse shotters tuning in. Good turnout today. Chloe Lizotte, Chris Wisniewski, Ella Bittencourt, Jordan Kronk, Nicholas Rapold, Ryan Swen, Susanna Gruder, and Julian Allen.
Oh,
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
I'll go judge your choices now on my own time.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Badatri. Please come again, both of you.
Yes,
Congrats
of
on the
course.
book. We loved having you here.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.